Coming up, an acknowledgement from Kyrie Irving that the Brooklyn Nets simply were not tough enough over the last couple of seasons. Are they tough enough now? Do they need to get tougher? And why does everyone care about being tough when you're playing basketball? We break it down next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Who do you think you are? We are the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings. From DraftKings to FanDuel, he's got you covered. At Doug Norrie on Twitter, at Adam Armbrecht for yours truly, as I break down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And Doug, let's talk about getting tough, because recently we talked about this in the offseason. I don't know if it falls under the same category, physical enough, tough enough, and is a guy like Markieff Morris that key little contributor to kind of bring a little bit of edge to this roster. Recently, Kyrie Irving had an acknowledgement around this team not being tough enough, and I just have a concern that this is somehow becoming a catch-all for anything that wasn't going well for this team.
You think this is the new culture? Like, you think this is the new
culture, baby?
This is the new buzzword. That's like, it used to be culture. Then that drove everyone absolutely bonkers over a couple year stretch. And then now it's toughness. That's fine. I'm all for a new word. I'm team new word here, because the culture one had run its course. We had been given all the culture talk we ever needed to hear about a buzzword that's impossible to quantify and means something different to everyone else. Yeah. Great news. We have another buzzword that's impossible to quantify and it means something different to everyone else. And I think these guys are also correct, right? Like, I think that there's also some feeling correct, whatever it ends up being, even if it's different for different people. I think that this sort of catch-all word probably in some ways does describe some of the problems the Nets have had in the past on sort of a high, unquantifiable level, in that while there has been resiliency around problems, their view of it is that it hasn't been good enough. The league's view of it is that it hasn't been good enough, and therefore something else needs to change on a toughness and cultural level. So I do agree with them when they say this, because it's one of those things when Markieff says it and Kyrie says it, you sort of quietly nod your head and say, that makes sense. Yeah,
grit, hustle, determination, right? Whatever. There's, I think, a lot of verbiage you can throw underneath this. And so here, it's two sides of it. When Markieff Morris says it, and this isn't about, because it came from Kyrie, could have come from Kevin Durant, could have come from Sean Marks, could have come from Steve Nash, anybody that had been a part of this organization. When it comes from Morris, it's this outside kind of commentary on the team. When internally they take that on, I just wonder how you identify and make the adjustment from that understanding. And we're going to talk about the new players they brought in. Does that make them a tougher team? And can Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and some of the high-level players really be, quote-unquote, tougher on the basketball court? So we're going to get into all of that. But Kyrie Irving specifically, his just quotes on this referring to these last couple of years.
Okay, yeah, so it's actually kind of funny because Kyrie's are a little bit inside from the outside looking in also.
Right,
because he talks about, I'll just read it to you and you can make this determination on your own. Part of this is a quote that this is from Nets Daily. I'm reading it from Nets Daily. I actually don't know if this was just made to the overall media, but I'm reading it from Nets Daily, so they'll get the source here. The low-hanging fruit that we could honestly all agree on is sometimes in possessions we're not playing hard enough. Okay, I'm shaking my head. That's my parentheses. You saw it against Miami the other night. They were physical, and we don't want that to be our stigma or our MO in the league, said Irving. Everybody knows each other, but the most physical teams usually win ball games, especially down the stretch. I do find it funny that Kyrie used the example of the Miami game in which he did not play as the example for the lack of toughness. I'm laughing about that. That's not really a Kyrie drag here. I think he is owning that as part of his own style too. But that was at least the first part of that quote. Does that resonate with you when you hear about the physical nature of this team as opposed to maybe someone like Boston that's was super physical with the Nets last year that could not, and they just simply couldn't contend with the physicality. We've talked about the physicality as being a byproduct of the Nets being undersized at the time, but maybe it does speak to a larger issue where physicality is not a big part of their game, and maybe it needs to be.
Yeah, so I'll use Miami as the example, not even this particular game, because I think it's hard to say, were we tough enough in a game where we didn't have multiple players, et cetera? It's preseason. But we talked about Jimmy Butler last season, and where is he as a profile, his player profile in the league? He is so far above maybe what his skill set dictates, because he also brings this edge and this mentality to his game. That's always usually important for guys that are a top 50 player, but want to elevate to top 35. A guy like Marcus Smart, right? Top whatever, 60 player, but wants to be a top 40. You do it in the margins and all of this dirty work. So while I acknowledge that, yes, you want to be a tougher team, and I'll include the first preseason game where I mentioned this on the post-game podcast. I thought Kyrie Irving, he was getting after it. Like, he was getting pretty aggressive on the defensive end. He was down on the floor a lot. So if we're going to just focus in on Kyrie Irving's comments on this, it looks like he is both speaking to the issue and trying to actively improve it. The question now becomes, when you look at the players on this team, are all of them capable of leaning into this facet of their game and maybe not having it ultimately come at the detriment of other areas, successful offensive sets and functional smart defense, as opposed to a little bit erratic and maybe getting a little over physical for the sake of not being a team that's viewed of lacking toughness?
Yeah, I think their toughness is just going to be more about resiliency rather than like gooning it up on the court. Right. And just, and not like there's any teams that really do that to a huge degree. We're not talking about, 80s Pistons here, and there's no teams that operate like this, really. There are teams that you think about probably.
You think they mean just like Draymond Green punch a teammate in practice? Is that maybe the mentality we're bringing?
Man, I'll tell you what, this is going to sidetrack real quick. I sent out a tweet this weekend, and it's one of these ones. It's like, you can tell real quick how many people can figure out a joke as compared to just, because I did a trade machine. It was Draymond and Jordan Poole for Ben Simmons. and I was just like, we'll work it out once they're in the building. Fine. So obvious.
Perfectly.
I mean, so obvious, right? Like what I'm talking about here, like that it's a joke here, and people were like, "No way, we don't want."
How could you possibly suggest, given what just occurred?
That's not going to help the Nets. I was like, you think the two guys, the one guy who just absolutely decked the other guy in practice, don't want to come? You don't want to bring them into the building as part of the trade, regardless, though. Yeah, but I mean, Draymond would be viewed this way, or that. Terrible incident aside, Draymond would be viewed as one of these guys who plays above a different level because the physicality and then combined with the smarts that he has on the basketball court, combine him into being a super tough player where the sum is more than the parts, right? And I think that that's like something the Nets have not really had. Again, a lot of this becomes easier when you're winning. Like when you're losing, it's easy to mention culture, and it's easy to mention toughness and these things. Those things don't get mentioned as much when the results on the court are good enough. I do think, though, from a physicality standpoint, they're never going to be there. But what Kyrie mentioned around like punching above your weight, which I think is something he does on the court. Like you mentioned him getting it after on the defensive end. Yeah, he's not going to outbody anybody. But is he a great defender? No. Does he give max effort defensively? He does a lot of the time. And that's toughness. Like that's going to be like the version of toughness that they're going to need. They're not going to be able to be overly physical with teams, but they can make up for certain things that they don't have, that they aren't as good at by just effort. And I think that, frankly, effort has been a problem for them at times. I want to get your opinion on that, about whether you think the effort is something that has been a concern for them over the short term, maybe the long term as well. First, if you haven't tried Built Bar Puffs yet, you're depriving yourself of one of life's great joys. Guess what? They got a new flavor out there. It's covered in chocolate, and Built Bar has done it again. They have the cookie dough chunk puffs. It's a light, chewy texture. Real cookie dough chunks, of course, are 100% covered in real chocolate as well. All the joys of eating cookie dough without the hassle of making it. Plus, it's healthy for you. Listen to these stats. We love stats. 160 calories, 15 grams of protein, 100% covered in real chocolate. They just do all the stuff that you want with the cookie dough, and they make it healthy for you as well. You go to built.com, use the promo code LOCKEDON15 to get 15% off of your order. Grab those cookie dough chunk puffs. The 15% works for the whole host of different products that Built Bar has. You're going to find something you like over there. Built.com. Use promo code LOCKED15, 15% off your order. Promo code LOCKEDON15 at built.com.
So you posed the question there around, do I think that this team has lacked a toughness that we're using now as the new buzzword? Again, something that we talked about ahead of, and when the Nets, well, Giants, yeah, listen, I got Giants on the brain, guys.
Maybe London, maybe.
We talked about this when Kevin Durant was first joining the team, when Kyrie was first joining the team. The precursor to that was the Spencer Dinwiddie era, when they're surging to the playoffs, and D'Angelo Russell and all these things they're accomplishing, where you go, gosh, this is a gritty team. Yeah, because they don't have the talent level to be able to go on deep playoff runs and be someone you considered a real contender. So I think there's that shift. Certainly the role players on the team then are supposed to be the guys that pick up that element of identity for this team. And so yes, I think they have lacked it. But I'm going to include Kevin Durant in this portion of the conversation, because Kevin Durant's not he's not, I'm going to say tough player, but you don't want Kevin Durant getting gritty on the defensive end of the floor. You want Kevin Durant exerting all of his energy offensively, being a dynamic playmaker, and elevating the play of those around him. That's not to say that I don't expect Kevin Durant to get up on guys and use his size and his length to impact things on the defensive end. But I do wonder the idea of we got to get tougher. Well, that's a calling card to the bench, or it should be, more than it is to the superstar players. And we know what Ben Simmons' role is going to be defensively. And maybe that's the way this compartmentalizes a little bit. Yes, Kyrie Irving can dig his heels in as a guard and be a high energy and effort guy defensively. Ben Simmons can legitimately maybe only focus defensively and be a real guy that brings that toughness to this Brooklyn Nets roster. I said this to you before we got on, Kevin Durant to me is Muhammad Ali, man. He's too pretty. He's too pretty. He's too smooth. You can't catch me. I don't need to do the dirty stuff, because that's how good my game can be. So I do think it is about striking a balance now for this team. Yes, you need toughness, but it's got to come from the Marcus Smarts of the world, right? It's got to come from the role players. And that's the question. Do they have those pieces on this roster to carry that load at times? I have a specific player in mind when we talk about this. Do you see there being enough guys that have that in their game that can contribute consistently?
Yeah, I think they have to be players that the rest of the team respects. They have to be players that are kind of doing more with less. I think that's which is one of my all-time least favorite stupid corporate buzzwords, but I'll use it here I'll just use it here because it's kind of is apropos. Because it's saying that to take that Draymond Green example, it's saying, hey, there's certain things, you don't do everything perfectly, but you do the best you have with what you have, right? And I think that in the past, the Nets, last season, to some degree, and other seasons have struggled to get that from players. Are we getting anything more than what they're already good at? Or are the Nets, being resilient in times where it looks like they're getting down? Are they able to kind of put away teams, step on their neck? We saw this at multiple, maybe I'm getting a little far afield here, but how many times did we see last year where they would get a lead and then they just wouldn't be able to close teams out, and Kyrie and Katie are ending up having to play more minutes than you want, right?
And this is, so I'll interject just quickly because then it's saying, well, Patty Mills isn't going to be that. We know that Patty Mills is a quote tough player, but he can't do it for his size. Seth Curry is not that guy for you. Bruce Brown did that last year. I think Royce O'Neal immediately becomes that kind of guy for you this year with a little bit more to him, right? We said a little bit more meat to him. I think he can do some more things for you, but that's Joe Harris. He's not that guy. Now he can give you maximum effort, but it's going to be hard for me to label Joe Harris as being a tough player for the Brooklyn Nets outside of saying the guy runs amok, he knocks down his shots, he gives you everything he has. But toughness is such this razor thin thing you're trying to identify that I don't think falls underneath the purview of most of these players, short of saying, as you continue here, I have one guy that I actually think maybe carves out this role beyond, we mentioned Markieff Morris, if he ends up actually being on this roster.
Yeah, it's really funny because I think in general, you and I as a podcast and guys who just talk in general, you and I talk a ton. We're just friends in real life too, right? We're family in real life. So I think we spend a lot of time talking about this, and these kind of.
I'm often asking you, are you tough enough?
It's true. Add more toughness to the show. You got to add more toughness to the show. It's just not getting it. No, I think you and I don't really we don't really spend too much time delving into these waters because I think a lot of times it's silly, honestly. I do think a lot of times talk like this around just broad words that lack definitions or lack quantifiability or whatever are silly, because it's like the thing about like the word clutch. I think that word is silly usually, right? Because it's just, you can cherry pick times you think someone's super clutch, and then you can forget about the times they aren't, just to fulfill a narrative for yourself that like defines something that is undefinable. Right. That being said, I think it is funny to think about this team in these terms, because there is like this sort of like je ne sais quoi, like some unexplained thing that has been a problem for this team over the last couple of years. And I think it is a part where when they're down, being able to really, rally all the way back. And they got swept by the Celtics, right? We have lots of examples of this. Like, swept by the Celtics on a buzzer beater. They got swept by a team where they were in every single game, and they lost the first game on a buzzer beater. Like, that's not a team that should have been swept, right? Yeah, they had problems. Were they going to win the championship? No, but should they have taken a game? Of course. They were in every game and lost every game.
That's a really good example of quote toughness. Last season, you're not going on a deep playoff run. The team is a mess. Yeah. There's all kinds of things happening, but you're better than getting swept by the Celtics in 4 games. Like, that maybe is the best version of defining it for the Brooklyn Nets. Go win a game or two, fellas, symbolically, because you are tough enough to say, we're not going to go out with a whimper, which they 100% did.
Yeah, and so if you use those as examples, you have I was going to give other examples, and it's not like would an NBA player look, is an NBA player tougher and more resilient than me? I mean, of course. Like, I'm not comparing myself. I'm not comparing these guys to average human beings, right? They are a different level of physical.
Oh, and frankly, I think okay, this is it's a fun conversation, because you just said like, no. Physically, I'm never going to say like I'm tougher than most NBA players, but I think that's maybe the difference of what we're talking about here, because it's not, I don't necessarily, we've said this here, there's a physical toughness, which you either have the meat on your bones or you don't, but then there's the mentality. So like when I say Marcus Smart, when I say the Markieff Morris brothers, both of them are considered this way. When you think about a Jimmy Butler, when you think about, you mentioned Draymond Green, there are guys like I don't think about Giannis as being a tough player. It doesn't take anything away from what he is. I don't think Jokic is a tough player, but there are attributes that you associate with specific players. And I think almost more often than not, it is about just the mentality. It's about, I'm going to throw myself. You know who was a tough player we'll say 2 years ago, more specifically for the Brooklyn Nets after the buyout? Blake Griffin was a tough player for the Brooklyn Nets, because he was willing to stick himself in harm's way in physical moments, because that's what his role was. That's where he was going to identify his value for the team. And that's where I think there's this sliding scale around it, because the better you are as a pure talent in the NBA is the less that you necessarily need to be tough and just to associate in real life. So it's a mentality. I'm tough when it comes to my approach to the way I want my podcast to go. I want them to be good. I want it to be a quality product. So I have a toughness around. I have a mentality of wanting to be the best I possibly can. That doesn't have to do with physicality so much to me as like mental makeup when we're talking about NBA players.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm just saying I'm only comparing the NBA players to other NBA players. That's all. That's the only in this scenario. I'm saying that like, in trying to kind of figure out what we mean by these things.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Keeping it in a bubble. And I even have, I'm just keeping in that bubble. Cause like, obviously if any NBA player came up to, they would win. Right. Like in a ton.
I'm pretty sure.
And it's
70-30. I don't know.
You mentioned, we're going to switch gears here in a second, but like when you mentioned Giannis too, it's funny about Giannis is like mentally tough. That guy's about as mentally tough as it gets. Remember, like if you think about how far removed are we from entire stadiums chanting down how long it took him to take free throws and he was missing it. And he just like didn't care, got past it, got better at free throws and moved on. Like, and obviously, and it's been long talked about that he's, like they had to lock the gym for him to stay out of it, right? Like, because it was just like he was going to hurt himself if he just continued to go to the gym at the breakneck pace that he wanted to. All this being said, this comes in so many different forms. And I think a lot of the different forms that it comes in are things that no one would ascribe to the Nets having in the past, or at least in the recent past. It's like whatever, honestly, almost except for Durant. I would put Durant not in that category because I just think that he mentally and physically is beyond like almost everybody else, right? Like he doesn't seem to be bothered by other things and he kind of just moves on. Maybe you say, well, the trade demand, puts a little, chip in that. I don't really think it does. And to some degree, coming back from the trade demand shows a different side that like is probably a positive, right. All things considered. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about this toughness around where the Brooklyn Nets fall in it. First, going to talk to you about our friends over at Prize Picks. If you're over at Prize Picks, it's really kind of just the best daily fantasy version that you could get out there. You're not over there making a bunch of, you're not making it like trying to figure out a bunch of salary stuff. You're just putting in entries on Prize Picks. You're going above or below the projections that they have just and saying, hey, more points. Luka Doncic, 26.5 points, more. Luka Doncic, 26.5 points, less. And you're just choosing to go against Prize Picks rather than all these other entries that are out there trying to just kind of outshark your way through the market. Prize Picks has solved all that and really made the best version of a daily fantasy that you can get. It's super easy to play. You can put in entries very, very quickly. You can track how much you won over there on Prize Picks. You pick 2 to 5 players. You just decide if they're going to score more or less than the Prize Picks projection, and you can win up to 10x your money on any entry. No competing against other people. Just like I said, you versus the projections and just all the sports they offer too. NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL, PGA, the list goes on. We'd be here all day. Prize Picks has all of it up there for you. Safe and fast withdrawals, currently operational in over 30 states and Canada, our friends to the north. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive 100% instant deposit match up to $100. You have to use the promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. You can do the math and all those other numbers in between. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks.com. Daily fantasy made easy.
Doug Norrie's going to lay down on the floor and take a breath. And in the meantime, we're going to talk a little bit about, this idea of toughness, obviously it starts at the highest level. I do think that it permeates from your superstars down. So this does need to be something that Kyrie Irving is mentioning, and then also showing that he can lean into whatever this mentality obviously covers when we talk about toughness. The other thing is then right now, do the Nets have the players to do that? So I mentioned guys like, I think Patty Mills is a tough player from a mentality and mental makeup standpoint, but physically it's going to be hard for him. I don't look at Seth Curry as being a physically tough player. So this is where I thought the real question became. First, I think that Day'Ron Sharpe might be the guy on the roster currently that you'd say, hey, go in and be physical with somebody. I mean, show that toughness, right? And that means maybe getting some fouls. That could be as important of any role as he's going to have, including grabbing some rebounds and continuing to develop. The other side of it is, as I mentioned with Kevin Durant, I know that you need to have the, quote, toughness to be successful. But if we are parsing the definition of it around physicality versus mentality, I tend to say, well, the Brooklyn Nets kind of want to be the sexier version of toughness in the NBA. You have elite level offensive talents. You have a bunch of sharpshooters. Part of being too tough to beat is that you couldn't come back on us. Not because we were burying you defensively, which I think they should do some of with Ben Simmons, but just because we're too effing good on the offensive end. You can't catch up with us. We don't need to be physical. Go ahead, take your looks. We're going to go ahead and sit back and see if you can overcome these deficits we put you in. That to me is maybe the best version of the Brooklyn Nets this year. To say nothing of mental makeup, I think Ben Simmons and that toughness that's going to be a question mark here that he has to check off for himself.
And that's a version of this that we got in the brief times that we saw the Harden, KD, Kyrie situation going, was this team would just crush people. Like if you think back one season before this, when it goes back to the Celtics series, the one basically series they had every guy healthy, they destroyed. I know Tatum came and just put on like a 50 burger on them and they won the one game. The other games, the Nets just completely destroyed the Celtics. Like they, and maybe you want to say, well, that one game, yeah, you can take a game off when you're beating teams by 20 points in the playoffs. Like, okay, you take a game off because one guy is just putting on a show. But that team was like, hey, you can't keep up with us offensively. Good luck. We're just going to absolutely pour it on. Yeah. And they would have almost definitely won the championship with that team had everyone just stayed healthy on the simplicity of what you just said, which is good luck. Do we need to be the best defensive team in the world? No, because guess why? We'll trade our 3 for your 2 every single time, right? Or we'll trade our 2 for your 1.5, or whatever we're talking about possession wise. Like that is basically what that team was built on. Do they need to be the best defenders? Of course not. It doesn't matter because they're going to take the thing they do well, lean all the way into it, and just destroy you to the point where that sort of version of toughness will make it seem so you have no chance to ever come back. You will mount no comeback against us, because just when you think you will, we're going to hit another shot. And you know what's funny? I mean, I don't know. I know you want to say one thing. I've thought about this the other night, and I know every team thinks this about themselves. Like every fan base thinks this about themselves. So I'm couching this by saying I think this is a donkey fan thought process, but I think it's also true. Think about it, how many times it feels like you've seen the Nets over the last couple of years lose a 50-50 ball, or have what we would qualify as a very good defensive possession where like the ball just bounced the wrong way and the other team got it for an easy basket.
Yep.
I know that as fans, we are tuned into this more for our team than for other teams. I would be shocked with those stats if the Nets were not below average in those things. Like just having watched them over the last couple, like specifically the last year plus, it does feel like at times they have even good possessions on the defensive end get wiped away because there's one little mistake or one little ball goes the wrong way or something like that. Like, does that make sense? And I'm admitting that I think that usually when I hear this stuff, I hate it because it's like, well, we always get, new pitchers always shut us down. Like this is the old baseball one. It's like, yeah, that doesn't really happen more statistically. I do feel like I need to find the stat that backs this up, because I'd be floored if the Nets were in the top half of the league in winning 50-50 balls or second chance possessions or something like that. We just know they don't. They get killed in the offensive glass. So like it's just like all these little things where they've had problems that we would probably, when we look at it, that's the thing we think of as something the team lacks.
Of course, and we'll talk about throughout the rest of this week here ways that they can improve this area. But I'll use the other team I cover, the New York Giants. Guess what? They are a team that the bad bounce, the fumble, the interception, the untimely turnover, it always came at the worst possible moment in recent years. This year, there's been times when the bad bounce and the fumble could have been recovered by the other team, and it would have ripped your heart out. And instead, it bounced back to the Giants. Instead, it fell to the Giants. Instead, the bad play came in their favor. So yeah, sometimes those things add up. Whatever it accounts to, whatever it's associated with, it does happen. So when you watch them as much as we do, I think you just do kind of say, bounce of the ball this year would more often than not go our way, as donkey as it may or may not be.
All right, we're going to close it out here. Hopefully, we'll get tougher as the season goes on as well. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Appreciate all of the YouTube comments we've gotten over the last, just like a couple of weeks. The numbers have just gone totally crazy. We really, really appreciate everyone jumping over there on YouTube. So make sure you subscribe. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast, Spotify, iTunes, totally free. And that's the number one way to help us grow the podcast.
It's undefinable, this thing. It's what the French call a certain I don't know what. Austin Powers.
One of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.